Country Extra.
Hello, my lovely listeners. It's me again, Paul Jennings, Black Country Radio. And we've got a studio guest in the audience. And in the audience, I'm sorry, we've got a studio guest. There's no audience. I've got two people on the opposite side of the desk to me and a person to my left. A bloke called John Price. Can you introduce yourself? Tell me a little bit about yourself, John.
Yeah, well, I'm from the Black Country. Yeah. I'm old enough to remember a character called Archie Hill when he did a TV series back in 1974.
Yeah.
This was something that stayed with me for many, many years. And a few years ago, when I was walking the canals, he came into my mind again, and I set out on a project to rediscover him as both a writer and a TV presenter. I found out an awful lot about him. Sadly, he's no longer with us, but I was able to contact his son.
Yeah.
I've seen films of the TV series that I remembered from so long ago, and I've read a lot of his books as well. And I've spoken to the Black Country Society about him. I've published articles about him, and I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to share with you some of the things that I found out about him.
Well, we're very grateful that you've come in, to be honest. I mean, I've got to say, to my eternal shame, I'd never heard of the bloke, but I've been on your website and I've seen the articles that you wrote about him, and little bits have come back to me. Mm-hmm. So just tell us from the beginning, who was Archie Hill?
Well, he was born in 1928 in Blewett Street, which is in Pensnet, Brierley Hill, just about a mile away from here.
I know it, yeah.
Yeah, he was born into a family of 11 children.
Yeah.
10 of which survived infancy, so he was a very large family. 1928 was the time of the Great Depression, of course, so his circumstances were very, very difficult indeed. And that is what formed him and his life and much of his writings as well. His was never an easy life, but he was an enormously talented man, and he was able to articulate some of the difficulties that he experienced and bring to life that era and the way the Black Country was in those days in a way that I think very few writers have ever achieved. What we know of him mostly comes from his autobiographical writings. He wrote two books which were really autobiographies, though from different perspectives, but he wrote other things about his own experience as well as 4 novels. Now, the central feature of this child, as I've mentioned, really is deprivation and poverty, and he had a difficult relationship with his own parents as well.
Yeah, we'll sort of... His dad was an alcoholic, wasn't he?
Well, his dad was somebody who certainly drank a lot. I mean, he characterises as somebody who could be decent and thoughtful when he was in the mood to be so. He was a man that was greatly skilled with his hands. He could make furniture. But he could also sew. He could embroider and cook. He had a wide range of skills. Yeah. But he was also somebody who drank too much and was given to go on alcoholic binges, and when that happened, a cruel streak of his nature would emerge, and money that he'd earned would be dissipated, debts would arise, and the family would be forced to move here, often in the dead of night.
Oh, the old moonlight flit.
Yes, that's right. Okay. Yeah. So he lived an itinerant childhood, really. The family were moving on. They lived in Brierley Hill, Cannock, Kinver, Stourbridge, Wordsley, really. So he saw an awful lot of the Black Country, but in his own particular way. His father was no respecter of the law. Perhaps he couldn't afford to be, because there was no employment opportunities in the 1930s. Yeah. The family experienced extremes of poverty, and this led him to petty crime. He was no gangster or anything like that. But
this is the dad we're talking about.
This is the dad. Yeah. Okay. This is Billy Hill, his name was, and so he did have several spells in prison when the family again would struggle. Yeah. One example of the erratic nature of his father's life is that one day Hill's father, he came home with a pony and trap, which was right. Which was a very prestigious thing to own in those days and in those communities. But it had obviously been stolen, he says. But in order to disguise this, Hill's father got got Archie Hill to join with him in painting the horse a different colour. So it's instead of being a grey horse, it ended up as being a brown horse. And
Oh my Lord.
they repainted the trap as well, and so with this manoeuvre, they were able to move on in the world, and the pony and trap not only lent them prestige, it also gave them an opportunity to earn some money.
Yeah.
So suddenly they were that little bit better off. They started a small greengrocery business, but that didn't really last long. And even then, it didn't work out properly because the family were able to bring an extra room into use. And furnish it with quite expensive furnishings, but they excluded the kids from it. So again, it just divided the family more. So it was just for the parents only, this extra room.
Well, to be honest, I mean, growing up, I can remember, and a lot of people, a lot of our contemporaries can remember, the front room that you weren't allowed to go in on certain days. It wasn't as harsh as that, you know. But so he stole this pony and trap, and he nobody thought to say, where's that pony and trap come from?
They probably did, but I imagined that they got more sense than to ask. They probably guessed.
Right.
I mean, Hill speculates he probably travelled some distance, maybe to the potteries or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
You want from round the corner then?
no. So nobody would. But even so, he saw fit to disguise it, and he also had to disguise. There was markings on the hooves of the pony, which indicated who owned it, and he had to change those as well.
I mean, he sounded fairly enterprising, the dad did, although he was no master criminal. But, you know, and he seeming to do things for his family more than anything else.
Well, he did in those cases, yeah. I mean, Hill's perception was that he was more likely to. I mean, the whole thing ended when he sold the pony and trap and went on an enormous bender for 3 days, and that was the end of that. Yeah, normal service was resumed in the household. So. And he could be violent when he was when he was under the influence of alcohol. So Archie Hill's childhood, it was full of difficulties and grievance, and I think his natural talent sometimes showed through at school.
Yeah.
But for the most part, like he resembled in his father. I think he had a rebellious nature.
Yeah.
He resented the fact that he would get benefits such as free school milk, and other means-tested vouchers. He felt that this made him stand out as somebody who was less affluent even than the people around him.
Yeah.
It alienated him from the school system.
So, I mean, you said they had quite an itinerant lifestyle, one step ahead of the rent man and all that. Did he spend most of his time around the Black Country, his early years? Yeah,
he would be in the greater Black Country, yes. So I don't think he ever. I think he spent a little bit of time with some Welsh relatives once when there was nowhere else to send him, but that was all really. The rest of the time he was rooted in the Black Country, and as a kind of a counterpoint to the difficulties he had with his father, he had a difficult relationship with his mother as well.
Yeah.
But he did form friendships and bonds with older men of his father's age, who showed him a kind of a different side of life, who were more gentle in a way and caring. There was one character he refers to in his book as Conk.
Yes.
Who essentially showed him something of the natural world, albeit through poaching. So he's again on the edge of the law.
Yeah.
But he showed you the fields and the meadows and how the natural world operated.
Yeah.
And he also there's another character he calls Pope Tolly, who was a man who was very keen on standing up for the rights of people.
Yeah.
And I think taught him a lot about dignity and self-respect. And so he learned from those people. And there's another character called Old Billy, but I think from my research is someone called Billy Swingewood, who was a famous glass worker.
Yeah.
And he would create beautiful tiny animals from like pencils of glass just in his own garden shed using a blowtorch. An extremely skilled man. And some of his work's still around.
Interesting life.
Yeah. Yeah, and so from him he learnt about skill, handicraft, and beauty. So from these other characters, he formed a kind of a counterpoint to his difficulties at home.
And these men, I mean, were like a gentler side of adult male life.
Yeah, I think that's what they showed him. I mean, they were strong men in their own way, and they had their own difficulties. But I think they stood up for him more, and gave him a better perspective on the world. And their characters come through a lot in his writings later on.
And these are in his autobiographical books, or are they his novels as well, or both?
Well, essentially his autobiographical books, but characters of that nature flicker in and out of the novels as well. They obviously made a huge impression on him.
Yeah. What sort of child was he like, do you think?
I think he was probably very difficult in a lot of ways. I think he was self-willed, and very intelligent as well. I should imagine very sharp in a streetwise kind of way.
Yeah.
So I would have thought throughout his life he's somebody who could flicker from one mood to another.
Right. Difficult, would you say?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, people later on described him as kind of a Jekyll and Hyde character. Somebody who could be very charming one minute, and very difficult the next. Sort of,
I don't know, tortured soul maybe. I've read some of the stuff that you've put on your site and about him, and done a bit of research myself. He could be quite scathing as well, couldn't
he? Yes, he had a way of turning on people. I think if you didn't like them. I mean, as we've spoken briefly about his mother. When he published his first book, he did not refer to his mother in a kind way at all, and this led to the extraordinary circumstance that his mother actually sued him, and successfully took him through the courts for about 15 references he'd made to her in the book, and as a result of that, she was successful in the courts. Yeah. All the books had to be gathered in; they were all pulped, and the book was reissued with all reference to his mother deleted from it. Which is something not many writers have to endure.
I've never heard of it before.
No, it's.
And were they ever reconciled?
No, they weren't. No, I think when he was. I think by then his mother was already quite old, and I don't think she'd lived that much longer after that.
Okay, so he's growing up. He's got this sort of Jekyll and Hyde type of upbringing, really. He got his dad and his mom, who his mum he wrote about disparagingly, and his dad in his books, as I gather. But then he got these adult males that were teaching him things that a lot of kids would have loved to have learnt, like poaching, which we'll come to on in a bit, because it stood him in good stead years later, didn't it?
Yes, that's right.
So, I mean, when did he move out of the Black Country? Because he moved on, didn't he?
Yes, that's right. He aged about 16 or 17, he applied to join the RAF police in 1945. So aged about 17.
Okay.
And then that's when he left the Black Country, and though he was to visit times thereafter, and perhaps lived for short spells after that. Essentially, that was the end of his Black Country life.
Yeah.
But it stayed with him, and his writings forever, really. And
as it does with a lot of people from the Black Country, that they move away, but they still maintain that connection, and because it moulds you. Where you're born and bred, it actually moulds you, doesn't it?
Yes.
Did he write much about his time in the services, or?
Well, he wrote one book which he called Sergeant Saab, which was about his time in Iraq, when he there's a lot of very vivid descriptions in that about the desert landscape.
Yeah.
Because he had a wonderful eye for landscape and countryside and local character, so that features very heavily in that book. And he was essentially a policeman with the RAF, but it would seem that the way he approached the job, there was a sort of edge of corruption to it. He would do petty black market dealing and things like that. But so he was all. It's strange that he should want to join the police force when he was always on the edge of the law, really. So that was. I mean, it could be that he saw the police as an opposition to his father, and anything that was against his father was a good thing.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, he probably saw the armed forces as a family.
Yeah, I think there was some of that, and it was certainly an escape, because one theme that comes through in a lot of his writings is the idea of a prison. And he came to see his family, the Black Country, as a prison, something that he wanted to escape from.
Yeah.
And joining the forces was certainly an opportunity to do that.
Because wasn't his first book? We'll come to that in a minute. But wasn't his first book about the Black Country quite dismissive?
Well, there was dismissive passage. I'd say it was ambivalent, really, because he speaks of the Black Country and the difficulties in with great length, and he does go into that. But I think it's associated with his circumstances. But it's also there's the elder people we spoke about who were the father figures, and he saw those as being the positive side of the Black Country very much. And I mean, I've got a passage here about the Black Country. Would you like me to?
Yeah,
to read it?
Great if you could.
Yeah. So this is from his first book, which is called A Cage of Shadows. And early on, he's setting the scene, and he's talking about the nature of his life. He said, "I knew," he said, "it was all a prison. Every bit of the system was a prison. Every rotten, God-forsaken minute. All you could do was fight and know that in the fighting you'd lose in the end. Life in the Black Country, among the reek and the heat of iron foundries, and the thunder of rolling mills, where sheets of steel were pressed and hammered out, and the sulky glower of pit heads stripped the countryside of all except smoke and dust. An area from which Hogarth and Dickens grew grim inspiration, and still could if they were still on the scene. The Black Country, spewing its filth, lacerated with sluggish canals, all sombre and dark and brooding, a place where men worked hard with the might of their muscles, drank hard, made love like rabbits, and bred almost as much. Strange, rough men whose everyday speech is still rich in pure Anglo-Saxon, who use words and expressions which were in vogue in the days of Chaucer. Men who delight in racing their pigeons on a Sunday morning, or their whippet dogs, or catching linnets and bullfinches for their bird cages. Gypsy-like men who invariably scorn the redresses offered by the civil courts, but settle their own arguments toe to toe, fist to fist." So
Wow.
it's quite a...
And when was that written?
This was written in about 1972.
Wow.
So, which is 50 years old.
That is a Black Country I think quite a few of us would remember, to be honest.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think you see that in a lot of the historical accounts of the Black Country,
Yes.
writing Eli Burritt's stuff and Malin's stuff. It's almost that similar thing. He almost distancing himself from it and looking at it from afar.
It is like an out-of-body sort of experience, I suppose, maybe.
Incredible. And the descriptive part of it is just amazing.
That's brilliant. That is. It's to my shame that I've never heard of the man, and but I'm definitely going to get into him. Should we go and get some music?
Yep. We've got a track by The Who to start us off with today. So let's have a
Country Extra.
Hello, welcome back. I'm here in the studio with John Price, and we're talking about Archie Hill. In the break, my producer Billy, we were talking about the humiliation and the shame of being different and having to rely on handouts and welfare, and the fact that the juxtaposition of some of us going to good schools, perceived as good schools, and rubbing shoulders with people that had money, and then yourselves, the sort of paradox of yourself being, in the case of Archie and some personal experiences that we've known, that kids have got all the money, and then you're made more than aware, just subliminally, by how poor you were and how different you felt.
It was probably the first time you experienced that you were different from somebody else, weren't you?
That's right.
And as we said off air, we were called out in assembly to stand before the headmaster's office to get the provident check. So obviously, the pupils had come past, and the ones that the ones that were from Edgbaston, Worley, perhaps, would then know that you couldn't afford. So they would then use that as a tool against you. And for a long time, I thought we were rich because our dad used to go take the Provident cheque to Adley's in Albury for your uniform and pay with a cheque. And so I had to question him and say, I've been told we're poor, but we've got a chequebook. And of course, then he had to explain what the Provident was, and also then, being incredibly wise, like most of the working class blokes were, explain that it's their loss and not your loss if they perceive the world in a different way to you. So it was almost like turning it on its head and saying, we might be poor, but we've got this.
Yeah.
It's just a great way of looking at the world.
It is. It's fantastic, and what a lesson to learn. From your dad.
Yeah.
You know how he must have gone up in your estimation and moulded you.
Well, it was very much, I think in the case, and you're probably right, it was very much that they didn't envy the other people because they'd got money.
No.
It was just that they'd got money, and that was it. So there was no, we want to be like them. It was just, well, that's the way of the world, son. You know? Right. Strange, isn't it?
That's brilliant. No, it is brilliant. And, it's... I think it's more relevant even today now with the way things are going on. Yeah. So let's get back to Archie, my newfound friend. So how long did he do in the RAF then, John?
He did about 3 or 4 years, something like that. It was during that period. I mean, he sadly followed in his father's footsteps in terms of drink. He started to develop a really serious drink problem of that time, but at the same time, he reckons he was successful in some way in detecting crime. I think he was promoted to sergeant, so that was
okay.
I think there's always a little background. He was a man of great ability. I think he probably was at school as well. There are hints. He did get to arts college for a couple of years towards the end of his school career.
Yeah.
So he passed an exam to get that, but I think also the what we've mentioned about him feeling a bit of an outcast because he came from a poor background probably meant he didn't apply himself as fully as he might have done if he'd had more encouragement. But he stayed in the RAF for 3 or 4 years and came back to the UK in 1950, and he came into the normal police force then.
Oh right, okay.
And so he served a couple of years as a policeman. He also got married, but neither of these things worked out for him at all. He carried on drinking, which made him unfit to fulfil the role of a police officer. He didn't treat his wife very well at all. It was, and she left him after about a year of marriage. So
this sort of history repeating itself, really, isn't it?
It is, yes. The very patterns of behaviour that he'd seen in childhood came back to haunt him again. It was, and by this stage in his life, he was very much on a downhill slope.
Yeah.
He one day he was living in a flat. He came back drunk. This was after his marriage had broken up. He left the gas on his cooker, and so people managed to intervene. That they neighbours apparently detected the smell, and they came in, and his life was saved, but people wouldn't believe that this was an accident. The police thought it was an attempt at suicide. And suicide was a crime in those days.
Yes, it was, yeah.
And considered quite a serious crime.
Yeah, you couldn't even be buried in consecrated ground if you committed suicide in those days. No,
that's right. It was a terrible thing, and he was charged and he was sentenced to 12 months, which they said he would have to serve at Stafford Mental Hospital.
What, because they thought it was a suicide attempt?
Because they thought it was a suicide attempt.
Well, that was quite compassionate of them, wasn't it?
Well, it was...
good grief.
Yeah, he was given what was supposedly treatment at the mental hospital, but we would hardly recognise it as that now. He was electric shock treatment he was given, which meant he was fed an electric current to the temples of his head until he was unconscious on several occasions. It's precisely what we'd call torture now. Yeah. And there were other treatments that were equally bizarre. They put him into an induced coma to try and settle his mind in some way, and leave him there for hours on end, and he's extraordinary. And he said that this period in the mental hospital, he said, more than anything else in my life's journey through such strange conditions and institutions, this one devalued my humanity the most in my heart.
Wow.
It was, but after 9 months, he wasn't released. He escaped. He had
One flew over the cuckoo's nest.
Surprise.
Yeah.
Go on, he escaped. Yeah.
And he spent a time then living wild in an area near Stourbridge. So this mental. So he then did gravitate back towards the Black Country, and spend perhaps a year living wild, just in a tent somewhere. He would, for food, he would steal from a local factory.
Yeah.
He was eventually the police caught up with him. He was arrested, and he was sent to Wakefield Prison.
Really?
Yeah, to serve a 2-year sentence, I think. So he then served a considerable time in prison. Where
Because he did poaching as well, didn't he? He did
poaching,
learning off conch.
Yeah. He became a good shot with an air rifle. Knew how to take animals down.
Yeah.
But without, but the other aspect the conch taught him was how not to cause undue suffering. So
Yeah.
he was always concerned that he should be in balance with nature to some extent when he was out in poaching mode.
Yeah. So tell us about Wakefield Prison then.
Well, there one thing he says in his book, he said it was a marvellous academy of crime. He learned how to do everything.
Yeah.
But what's perhaps the most interesting thing there is that a fellow inmate was the Russian spy and nuclear physician, I think, Klaus Fuchs, who I think he had leaked information to the Russians about the British nuclear program.
That's right, yeah.
Shortly after World War II. So, he became yet another mentor to Hill, and another father figure, which possibly the strangest of them all.
Yeah.
But he introduced Hill to a completely different world, a world of classical music, a wider range of literature. And he also advised him on taking his first steps as a writer. So Hill at this stage in prison, he managed to put together 1 or 2 short stories. He managed to write a little bit of poetry, and he would have Klaus Fuchs reading them through, saying what he thought. So there was the first few steps of what turned out to be his later career, where
That's amazing.
were achieved then. But it didn't. Things didn't immediately turn his way, though. After release from prison, he moved to London, and again he found himself living rough. He couldn't. He was unable to get a job. Presumably, his prison record would come into it.
Yeah.
So he couldn't even afford lodgings or rent. He lived rough near the Elephant and Castle, apparently. Used to drink rough cider laced with methylated spirits, which can't have been too enjoyable for anybody. Can't have done him a lot of good.
No.
But so he went on with this desperate way of life, living on Skid Row, as he called it, for about 2 or 3 years. And then in 1960, the turning point seems to be he met an Irishman in a public toilet. And this chap gave him some soap, a razor, and a comb, and it was that small gesture of kindness and generosity and decency that just turned the corner for him.
Yeah.
Based on this, he was able. He got a job. He rented a bedsit, and he was kind of back on the way into normal society again. Mm-hmm. And so he'd give it. He worked in a furniture warehouse. It was attached to a big furniture shop. He worked there for a number of years, and I think he also worked in the shop itself. And while working in the shop, he met the lady who was to become his second wife, and she saw a great deal of potential in him, saw his abilities, and they married in, I think it was 1962, and in 1963 their son Robin was born.
Yeah.
And so he was, right now though, he's still just doing a straightforward job, but his first writing job came in 1965 when he was given a column in in the Sunday People dealing with readers' problems.
Oh, right.
So,
Well, he'd know.
well, he'd know about the problems. Yeah, I mean, he may not be the first person you'd necessarily turn to for
No.
advice. You'd think.
Well, I don't know.
He was on his way back. He'd convinced the newspaper that he got something to tell these people.
Well, who best to sort problems out than a blue-rinsed woman smelling of lavender that's always lived an upper-class life, or somebody of Archie Hill's background?
I suppose it's like here, and when we have people like Alcoholics Anonymous in, or Suits, the drug group, it's their lived experience that people relate to. Isn't
Well,
it? So,
lived experience is exactly what he was able to bring to.
exactly.
That's an act of
this.
genius. That is putting him in charge of the
It's a
problem.
bit like, I mean, bringing it, God rest his soul, he's just gone, David Crosby, but I mean, he ended up being a sort of agony aunt, didn't he, on YouTube, and he said, why have you asked me? And he says, because you've lived everything through it,
Yes,
you understand everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is true, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is true.
No,
And
that's
it.
brilliant.
Yeah. He must have made a go of it as well, because he kept that job for a number of years.
Yeah.
And he was in the journalistic field, in the writing field. So it was another step on the way that was going to lead to him becoming a full-time writer in due course.
So when did he become a full-time writer then?
Well, it wasn't till the 1970s. But what he was to do to get him further on that route, he wrote short stories, just for his own amusement, really. But unbeknown to him, his wife sent them off to the BBC, and he had 3 or 4 of those produced as little plays, So that was another step. He wrote some episodes of Z Cars, which.
Wow.
Which, who knows, we may have seen, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Because he was a very popular programme in its day.
Yeah.
And and based on that, his wife funded him for a year. She says, I'll look after the bills for a year. You concentrate on writing. And that was in the early 1970s. And the result of that was the book I've already read from, A Cage of Shadows, which was...
absolutely amazing.
Yeah, it was controversial, certainly as regards his reference to his mother, but in other ways as well, because it didn't pull any punches about the difficulties of the life he's endured. It's kind of written in 2 parts. The first part is about his experience as a youth in the Black Country, and then it goes on to deal with the other things I've been talking about, which was. Things like his experience with the RAF, his experience on Skid Row, and it starts to open up the story of his redemption, stepping back into a more stable society. It gives a brief account of a kind of semi-reconciliation with his own father when his own father was dying.
Yeah.
But at least they did get back together. And Archie Hill tried to comfort his father in those circumstances, which was, and he kind of ends with his own gratitude for his that life's given him the opportunity to be a father, and to bring something to somebody else's life. It was very well received. People thought the rawness of the writing and the turn of phrase he often used was really quite outstanding. I think this book's been reissued not that long ago, about 5 or 6 years ago, by Tangerine Press, and it's still in print on that basis. So.
Well, I think it's relevant. It is relevant today.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just reading the back sleeve here. Jeremy Brooks of the Sunday Times describes it as the unemployed miners making a single pint last the whole evening as their wives make a handful of bones last the week. I mean, wow. The bitterness of the means test, the helplessness of the union. The people still alive that remember. I know that they're becoming few and far between now. But, oh my goodness me. His dialogue is beautiful, sharp, evocative, full of warm humour and the dark undertow of injustice. I mean, to be honest, the story that you've related to me is a bit like, although it's sort of experimental and he could always go back to his mummy and daddy's money, was what Orwell did in Down and Out in Paris and London and his experiences. And he was a policeman in the Burma police.
Yeah.
Orwell. Shades of that.
Yeah, there is, yeah. I mean, what he's talking about, there are memoirs and things about working class life, but he's talking about people even beyond that. I mean, someone might call them the lumpen proletariat. Yeah, the people who are in some ways not economically active at all, kind of outcasts, submerged elements in the and he speaks for those as well. Yeah. So he provides an insight into a strata of life that is very hard to find out, and he brings it to life as well. He makes you realise how difficult life could be at that end of society. And,
brilliant. And I think some people, without getting political, are experiencing it in this day and age.
Well, yeah.
You know,
is it around the same time as you'd have Kathy's Come Home and all those sorts of?
It's probably a little bit
before.
Yeah, so he was born. Well, the child is probably the Great Depression. Really, he's born 28. So yes, so a lot of the.
But aren't you alluding to, Billy, to the filming at the time, the early 60s?
The early 60s and that sort of era.
That would have been the time he was publishing the book.
When he started getting the earthy stuff coming through in terms of films and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Should we play another track?
I was just going to say, let's play another track. This is very apt, by the way.
Simon and Garfunkel.
The apt track, the bleakness of it all and everything reflecting, up till now, what we've been talking about, Archie Hill's life, but with a bit of light at the end of the tunnel, you know what I mean? So, I can't believe I've just said, you know what I mean? I don't know, Simon, I don't say that normally. But anyway, Simon and Garfunkel and the Boxer. So, tell us about Archie Hill's writing as regards the television series, etc.
Yeah, well, off the back of the success of A Cage of Shadows, people started taking interest in him, and he'd done one or two broadcasts on radio, but he got a commission to write and present a series called Archie Hill Comes Home, which was four half-hour programmes which would deal with the his memories of the Black Country, but also a history of the area. Yeah. Shown through different aspects. It starts with Hill sitting in a railway carriage with a train pulling into a Black Country station, and him explaining something about his involvement with the area. Yeah. What he said it's a strange thing that most Black Countrymen want to get away, but once they do, they can't wait to get back. There are roots and traditions like a mother magnet pulling her sons back home again, and that was very much the theme of this series. In the first episode was a general history of the Black Country. It was he talks about the history of the 40,000 nail shops that existed there in the 19th century. Yeah. He described it as bestial, savage slave labour. Mm-hmm. He talks about the times when plague hit twice due to insanitary conditions. But we also meet wonderful characters. There was Lucy Woodall, who was a chain worker for over 50 years.
She was the last known chain maker, wasn't she?
Yes, that's the last female chain maker. I understand. Yeah. There's an interview. With her, and he reflects that the Black Country. He said the name was given in derision, but it's now become something to be proud of. He says the measure of the region is the steel in the souls of women and men who lived and died in pitiful conditions. Mm. Yet he still yearns for something of the old days. He says something's gone away, something which cannot be named because words haven't been invented to describe it. But I think he's talking about the spirit of the people who managed to put lives together, notwithstanding the difficult conditions. Yeah.
Indomitable spirit.
Indomitable spirit. Yeah. In later episodes, he visits a foundry. He considers. He has discussions with craftsmen, and what he particularly likes is those kind of jobs where a man's head and body are working together. So they think they're artisans or artists. They're thinking through the work they're doing. Yes. He doesn't like the production line for production which he looks at. He finds that he thinks that's dehumanising.
Well, you're just an extension of a machine, aren't you?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, but and in the next episode, which is in some ways the highlight of the thing. He visits a glass factory, and he says, I may not know much, he said, but I know about glass. And cut glass crystal's not so fashionable these days in some ways, but he loved it. He described glass as beautiful as diamond and as permanent as memory, which was very, very interesting choice of words. And he again talks about the friend from his youth, old Billy Swingewood, who he says is a giant of glass. And he says when he put glass to the flame, to the blowtorch, he says the world exploded into beauty and colour. Yeah. He says exquisite and indescribable. And he concluded he was pleased with everything that's in the glassworks. Men are still in love with their own integrity, will not accept second best as good enough, only first best. Yeah. So this was a real kind of emotional heart of his series. Yeah. The visit to glass. He only showed people still working in the industry. And then in the final episode, he considered the recreational life of the Black Country. They visited the famous Old Swan in at Netherton.
Pardo's?
And there's actually a brief interview with Mar Pardo.
Is there?
There is.
Wow.
And comedy with Tommy Monton show. And he had a discussion with historian Tom Langley about bare knuckle fighting. Yeah. We see a poem recited by Harry Harrison. So it's quite a treasure trove of.
Can we get that again? Is it on BFI websites or anything like that? You're aware of?
It's on my own website.
Is it now?
It is. That's right. Yeah.
A whole series of Archie Hill Comes Home. Really?
Yeah. That can be.
What's your website, John?
It's called archiehill.uk.
Right.
And,
okay.
Yeah.
And it'll be on there for people to see.
Yes, it is at the moment. Anyway, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So I first saw it in the basement of the BFI film studio, which I had to go down to London. Yeah, and I was escorted into a dark room somewhere, and so it is a fascinating series, and it's got lots of stuff that's irreplaceable, really. Anyway.
Well, people, John's just going to repeat it for everybody else that wants to listen to it. Go on, John. What's your website?
It's archiehill.uk. So.
And it'll be on there then?
Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. You see, we also inform and entertain. Reithian standards here on Black Country Extra. So, what else was he doing?
Well, he... what he was doing then, he was carrying on a career as a writer through the 1970s. Yeah. But essentially, his methods of writing... He wrote 4 novels as well, but they were drawn from his own experience, by and large. There was a novel... mentioned the novel about the desert experience when he was in the army. Yeah. There was a novel about a pit worker in the Black Country. There was a novel about the canals, the canal building, where he did work for a short time when he was young. And there was one other novel as well, which was Prison Bars, which about his time in prison. So what he was doing all the time was kind of cannibalising his own life, and there's only so far you can go with that. He also wrote a non-fiction book about his stepson via his second marriage. Is the lady he married had a son who suffered from cerebral palsy. It was in a very difficult circumstances, and this short book he wrote, it's only about 100 pages, but it brings out the softer side of Hill and the compassionate side of his nature, which he says he learnt an enormous amount from this young man who was in such difficulties, and he obviously put an awful lot into helping him. Yeah, but so that kind of takes us and he wrote another book about his Black Country childhood, which was a bit softer in tone than The Cage of Shadows.
Yeah, I read about that because he was a bit warts and all with his first book, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. Yeah. So he wrote the book, then he made the TV series, and then he realised, I think, coming back to the Black Country, that there was rather more he enjoyed about it than perhaps he'd given himself credit for. Yeah. So he tried to put that into another book, which which was called Summer's End.
Summer's End, that's right. Yeah. And didn't he write something about the second meadow? Didn't he speak about the second meadow?
Yeah, there was 1982. The eighth book he wrote, which was the penultimate book of his. He called the second meadow. Here now his life was starting to unravel a little. There was a suggestion that his marriage was in trouble. And he took himself away to the countryside to live an isolated life for 3 months. Basically in the woods, he would rely on his poaching for a lot of his food.
Yeah.
And he would be a complete hermit-like existence, just living in a tent. And he used this to reflect and try to build another book out of. The conclusions that the idea that gives the name to the book is that from his vantage point on the edge of the wood, he could see 3 meadows, a progressive distance away.
Yeah.
And he noticed that all the animals lived in the first meadow. Yeah, and he set himself wondering as to why this was the case. The conclusion he came to was that the birds of prey were hovering over the other meadows,
concentrated on the second meadow.
and or at least the animals, the little mice or whatever, they could scuttle into the forest if they saw a bird of prey coming to them.
Yeah.
But that avenue of escape wasn't open to them if they were in the second meadow. So the further away from the forest they were, the more the risk. But at the same time, he noticed that perhaps the plants that were growing there were more nutritious as well. So the animals had this dilemma of whether to take the high risk option and feed in the second meadow or stay close to safety. And he kind of set himself the task of the rest of his life of moving to the more distant meadows and seeing more of life and trying to engage in life in a richer kind of way.
Do you think he was doing that all his life, with the ability to do so?
I think there must have been some of that, yes. I mean, he certainly was a risk taker, but sadly, the risk didn't always work, and by then his life was on the downward slope again. So it was the rich period of productivity in the 1970s that defined him. In some way, was already over. He'd only got one book left in him. He kind of mined his life for all the material he could find in it.
Yeah.
His marriage had come to an end. He was drinking again. So everything he'd worked for, in a way, had been short-lived, and it was a tragic life.
So what happened?
Well, in 1984, he produced his last book, which is called An Empty Glass, which reiterated a lot of the autobiographical stuff.
Yeah.
But he considered it now from the point of view of addiction and alcoholism, which had taken over much of his life.
Yeah.
And again, he comes back to the prison metaphor. Now he says alcohol's the kind of a prison from which he cannot escape.
Yeah.
Just as just before the book's published, he has a heart attack and he's told he can't drink again. So he says the future is now an empty glass. He's no longer living in a normal house. He's living in a caravan stuck out in the woods, about 5 miles from anywhere.
And when did he meet his end?
He met his end a couple of years after that. He took his own life, very sadly. He attached a pipe to the exhaust of a car, and sadly, this brilliant but tormented man, his life was at an end then. So his books largely disappeared out of print over the next 10, 15 years, but thankfully they came back with A Cage of Shadows, so there is still life.
That's brilliant.
In his work.
John, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you.
Wonderful.
And I am definitely going to start looking into Archie Hill's books and see if we can get the bloke into the modern consciousness, because he's certainly relevant.
Yeah.
And what a tortured soul, but what a fascinating story. John, it's been absolutely amazing. Thank you very, very much for coming.
No, absolute pleasure, thank you.
And hopefully we'll speak to you again.
Yeah.
Because you've got a few more things under your sleeves. Okay?
Yeah. Righty.
John, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Black Country Extra.